Hello and welcome to Sonnet Cast, William Shakespeare's sonnets, recited, revealed and relived. I am Sebastian Michael, and this is Sonnet 52. So am I as the rich, whose blessed key can bring him to his sweet uplocked treasure, the which he will not every hour survey, for blunting the fine point of seldom pleasure. Therefore are feasts so solemn and so rare, since seldom coming in the long year set, like stones of worth they thinly placed are, or captain jewels in the carcanet. So is the time that keeps you as my chest, or as the wardrobe which the robe doth hide, to make some special instant special blessed, by new unfolding his imprisoned pride. Blessed are you whose worthiness gives scope, being had, to triumph, being lacked, to hope. The astonishingly suggestive Sonnet 52 is the closest William Shakespeare has come so far to answering in his own words the question that has agitated readers of these sonnets for centuries. Is this a physical, even sexual relationship he is having with the young man, or could it not simply be one that is very close, maybe romantic, but nevertheless purely platonic? With its choice and precisely placed vocabulary, it relates an either already experienced or imminent reunion, and thus also marks the end of the prolonged period of separation that appears to have been imposed on Shakespeare and his young lover since Sonnet 43. What, though, does Sonnet 52 actually mean? So am I as the rich, whose blessed key can bring him to his sweet uplocked treasure. Thus, or now, or then, when I am back with you, in this way, I am like a rich man who has a blessed or fortune-bearing key which can bring him to the treasure that he has locked away in a safe place. The sonnet largely appears to stand on its own, but the so with which it opens does draw a link to something that has either just happened or is happening right now, and although it can only ever do so tentatively, this would suggest that a connection is being made to the previous sonnet, which talks about rushing home to the young lover. When that is done, when we are back together again, then this sense of feeling like a rich person kicks in. Also noteworthy is the reference to Sonnet 48, where I, the poet, lamented the fact that I was unable to lock up my most precious possession, the young man, except in my heart, where he, much to my concern at the time, was able to come and go as he pleased. The worry of that sonnet with these lines appears to evaporate. The which he will not every hour survey, for blunting the fine point of seldom pleasure. He, the rich man, will not survey or look at this treasure and examine it every hour, meaning all the time, or all too frequently, because this would diminish the exquisite pleasure of looking at and handling it. The fine point of seldom pleasure, through overuse, gets blunted. Therefore are feasts so solemn and so rare. This is why feast days are so ceremonial and special. Solemn here largely has a meaning of dignified and formal rather than the more contemporary sense of glum or cheerless. Its Latin origin, solemnis, literally means customary, celebrated at a fixed date, as Oxford Dictionaries defines it. Since seldom coming in the long year set, like stones of worth they thinly placed are, or captain jewels in the carcanet. because they appear infrequently in the annual calendar, and so they are like precious stones that are thinly placed in a piece of jewellery. The best and most valuable stones, the captain jewels, are those of which there are fewest in a necklace, a carcanet, which makes them all the more valuable. So is the time that keeps you as my chest, and so the time that keeps you away from me, meaning the time we spend apart, is like my chest, or sturdy box, or what today we would think of as a safe. As in Sonnet 48, and this is another clear reference to it, chest evokes not only these meanings but also the human chest, where the heart resides, and where in Sonnet 48 I thought I could lock up my lover for safekeeping, even though I acknowledged that there he was at liberty to come and go as he pleased. Or as the wardrobe which the robe doth hide, to make some special instant special blessed by new unfolding his imprisoned pride. Or the time that keeps you away from me is like the wardrobe, which hides a robe so that when I open it again and take out this special garment, it newly unfolds the pride that it represents and embodies and that had been imprisoned in the wardrobe. The use of the word pride here is no doubt significant, and we will look at this more closely because it of course means the splendour and rich possession which the bearer is proud to own and show off, but it also strikes a much more sexually suggestive note, and this can hardly be ignored here. Blessed are you, whose worthiness gives scope, being had to triumph, being lacked to hope. You are blessed, or even just bless you, who are of such great worth that when I have you, I am allowed to feel triumphant in this possession, and when you lack, because you are absent from me or I from you, I may still hold hope and look forward to the time when we are together again. Whenever we make bold statements such as this is a revelatory sonnet, which I certainly argue it is, or William Shakespeare with this unlocks his heart for us, to paraphrase William Wordsworth once more, we have to preamble this with the caveat, we only have the words. There is no physical, documentary evidence that clarifies anything about this relationship for us beyond conjecture and reasonable doubt, and there is extremely scant circumstantial evidence that may help us understand who the young man is and what the exact nature of their relationship. Many scholars, especially those of a generation who grew up in the mid-20th century, when English society, as indeed most other Western societies, took an extremely dim view of same-sex relationships, have settled into an approach that either skirts around the issue of sexuality altogether or goes so far as to argue that we simply shouldn't care who this person is or how Shakespeare relates to him, that as poetry this all lives in the mind of the poet who writes for the sake of writing alone in a world that is therefore abstract and removed from any real-life context. This is an essential point to make, and so I hope you will bear with me if I elaborate on this just a bit, because if we want to understand Shakespeare, we need to understand, on the one hand, the cultural context in which he writes, and also, equally important, we need to be aware of the cultural context in which he is being read and interpreted, because with anything that we read, but particularly with a sonnet like this, which has what some might consider to be contentious content, cultural context will determine how we understand what it says. Now, the editions of the sonnets that people of my generation grew up with were published in the 1970s and 80s and edited largely by scholars who had studied in the 1950s and 1960s. Homosexuality was illegal, not just frowned upon or faced with social prejudices, but forbidden by law in England and Wales until 1969, when it was partially legalised for men aged 21 and above, as long as any activity that could be seen as homosexual happened in private. Civil partnerships that afforded very similar but not entirely identical rights to same-sex couples as marriage were introduced in 2005, and full equal marriage in 2014. On the day I am recording this episode, Friday 8th September 2023, that's less than 10 years ago. Why should any of this matter to the discussion of a Shakespearean sonnet? Because for literally centuries, but most particularly ever since the highly censorious and moralistic Victorian era and deep into the 20th century, the idea that a romantic friendship, in inverted commas, between men could have a sexual component was widely, in fact almost generally, considered greatly disturbing. People at the time used words more like disgusting and vile, and therefore it was also considered fundamentally, morally wrong. Since we are on the legal and societal framework as a context, it is also worth bearing in mind and acknowledging that of course there were no LGBT rights in Shakespeare's day either. In fact, there was no conception of gay, lesbian, bisexual or trans as we understand these terms today at all. The term homosexual itself was not coined until the very late 19th century, and then in a clinical sense. So almost everything we today think and express about human sexuality is coloured entirely differently to the way Shakespeare and his contemporaries would have understood it. Without wanting to go into too much detail on sexual practice in a podcast on poetry, Christianity looked, and some people would argue it still looks, on all sex that doesn't serve procreation as sinful. And so under Henry VIII, the father of Queen Elizabeth I, Parliament in England passed the Buggery Act of 1533, which made sodomy, or buggery as it was referred to here without ever defining it, punishable by death irrespective of the gender of the persons involved. Under Queen Victoria in the 1800s, this law was repealed, and while the death penalty for this particular offence, as it was still very much considered, was commuted to a life sentence of penal servitude, what we otherwise know as hard labour, homosexuality remained punishable by imprisonment. This was not only enforced, but actively pursued right into the 1950s, with police deliberately setting honey traps to identify and arrest men for seeking sexual contact with other men, even in their own homes. And so we need to acknowledge two things. Number one, at the time when Shakespeare wrote this sonnet, as a man you could be put to death for being found to have had sex with another man, but this stark reality notwithstanding, men quite openly had lovers and favourites, including King James VI of Scotland, who became King James I of England at the death of Queen Elizabeth I. And so, while Shakespearean society was revulsed by certain sexual acts in particular, it had a remarkably relaxed, or at any rate flexible, attitude to human nature compared to English society in the 19th and 20th centuries. This does not mean that people were generally fine with men having sex with men, but the social context was complex, multi-layered, and at least partially defined by a Renaissance mentality and awareness that reconnected strongly with classical values of Greek and Roman antiquity, which, unencumbered by the moral code of the Abrahamic religions, had an entirely different approach to sexual relations to the one promoted by the Christian Church. Number two, For at least 200, more realistically nearly 300 years, William Shakespeare's sonnets were read in a cultural context that was fundamentally and vehemently hostile to the idea of men being sexually involved with other men. As a man, you could still get arrested in London in 1985 for kissing another man in the street, and so it need not surprise us that for centuries scholars and interpreters of these sonnets, written after all by the most eminent, most celebrated poet of the English language, have contorted themselves into finding ways of arguing that really these sonnets don't talk about sex at all. The time has clearly come to change that, and Sonnet 52 gives us ample reason to do so, starting at the end. To be had, to triumph, to be lacked, to hope. Neither Colin Burrow in the Oxford University Press edition first published in 2002, nor John Kerrigan in the Penguin Classics edition first published in 1986, both of whom I respect highly and cite repeatedly in this podcast, make any reference to the obvious and, though euphemistic, unambiguous meaning in Shakespeare of to be had. Take Sonnet 42, for example, that thou hast her. It is not all my grief, and yet it may be said I loved her dearly. That she hath thee is of my wailing chief, a loss in love that touches me more nearly. Loving offenders, thus will I excuse ye. We can really not be in any serious doubt that the young man having Shakespeare's mistress and she having him is a sexual encounter of some sort. Sonnet 129, which we will come to much later in the series, talks entirely about the sexual act and finds it, rather than the person, to be past reason hunted and no sooner had, past reason hated as a swallowed bait, on purpose laid to make the taker mad, mad in pursuit and in possession, so had, having and in quest to have extreme, a bliss in proof and proved a very woe. And yes, although it is the sex here that is being had, not the person, the intense wordplay once again does anchor the terms in each other inseparably, it would seem. Sonnet 135 is almost overburdened with innuendo, and it starts, "Whoever hath her wish, thou hast thy will." And indeed, the Oxford Dictionary's definition 2.10 of to have is simply to have sex with, so it is hard to argue that this is not what Shakespeare means here. What kind of sex is a wholly different matter, and not one that needs to concern us. There are things that may, and probably should, remain private, but the idea that to be had, to triumph, to be lacked, to hope, is anything other than the most artful wordsmith in the English language telling himself, his lover, and now us, that they have and have had each other in a sexual sense, is surely nothing short of disingenuous. On its own, this would be telling, but there is a build-up to it. So am I as the rich whose blessed key can bring him to his sweet uplocked treasure. It may or may not be a coincidence, and therefore it may or may not be a deliberately placed clue, but it is certainly the case, and therefore noteworthy, that here in the first line of Sonnet 52 is the first and only time that Shakespeare uses the word key in the entire collection. This is not entirely banal an observation. Key is a highly symbolic term, today much overused as an adjective, and so one might reasonably expect Shakespeare finding frequent use for it. He doesn't. He uses it here and here only. Then we get the sweet uplocked treasure. In the context of a rich person, the treasure is obviously their material wealth, their money and jewellery, which is here used as a metaphor for my lover who is my sweet treasure, a term of endearment we still use today for a lover. The which he will not every hour survey, for blunting the fine point of seldom pleasure. The layering and the build-up continue of all the words William Shakespeare already has at his disposal, and with his gift and given propensity for making them up as he goes along to great evocative effect, he chooses the fine point, which in itself may or may not have a subtly suggestive note to it, of seldom pleasure. Of course, he needs a rhyme with treasure, and what more obvious word would offer itself than pleasure? But Shakespeare, when he feels like it, does not shy away from eschewing the obvious, and here the other really obvious thing is that pleasure has a widely understood and instantly recognizable sensory, sensual, and sexual connotation. Frequently in these sonnets, but to cite just the one example which comes as a pair, sonnets 57 and 58, pleasure is clearly and deliberately deployed to mean sexual encounters or relations, as we shall see. The second quatrain yields no further clues concerning itself, as it does with the nature of religious feasts, but then he cranks up the tone another notch, as we noticed while translating these lines a little earlier. So is the time that keeps you as my chest, or as the wardrobe which the robe doth hide, to make some special instant special blessed, by new unfolding his imprisoned pride. Now, personifying the robe is not in itself unusual. We have seen this many times before and shall do so again. Shakespeare often refers to objects by the personal pronoun. Here, though, it results in a special instant being made special blessed, and note the rhetorical device here of repeating the word special by new unfolding his imprisoned pride. Granted, we can argue, and I know some people would, and in fact I pointed this out earlier, a special robe for a special occasion is a symbol and therefore expression of status, and thus by extension the pride the owner has in his possession. But after everything that's gone before, and knowing from the outset that the sweet uplocked treasure we are talking about is a young man, we would really have to be tone deaf once more to ignore the fact that pride is by definition a person or thing that arouses a feeling of deep pleasure or satisfaction, and so, unsurprisingly, also carries really rather strong sexual connotations. Some editors have suggested that Sonnet 52 is rich in further clues and secret meanings, noting, for example, that its number in the series 52 happens to equal the number of weeks in a year, and noting the strongly religious-themed middle section of the poem. This may well be so, but exploring these would take us entirely into the realm of pure speculation and theory, and my declared intention with this podcast is to listen to the words, and really the words only. And this much I strongly sense we can say. Sonnet 52 is a key sonnet. It does not unlock all of Shakespeare's heart for us. No one single sonnet does, but it forms a composition that comes so very close to being explicit in its expression of a physical dimension that, together with everything else we have learned so far, the innuendo of sonnets 15 and 16, the in itself revelatory sonnet 31, the complex triangular constellation of sonnet 33 intermittently onwards, and of what is yet to come, I am willing to declare my hand and say, this is, in one way or another, sex we are talking about. In all this, though, we mustn't lose track of the sheer joy and exuberance this poem conveys. From the dull drudgery and deprivation of slowly traipsing through the English countryside, we find ourselves in a wealth of sensory riches that celebrates at long last being together again. And if Sonnet 52 gives us a notion of a close physical, indeed sexual reunion, then Sonnet 53 gloriously supports this, reminding us, as it does in tone and wonder, of a blissful morning after. And so do join me again on Sonnetcast as we recite, reveal and relive the sonnets of William Shakespeare.